welcome to Once Upon a Town, the show that delves deep into Franklin history. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
Joe, today we'll be talking about grocery stores in Franklin, which is a topic I'm really interested in because it's fascinating to see all the different companies that have helped to supply food for Franklin residents through the years. So take us away.
There's been many stores in Franklin over the years. A lot of the stores were located downtown Franklin, but there was a lot of little neighborhood stores too, so hopefully we'll cover them all. And we'll start off with one that was downtown in one of the Fletcher blocks, and it was called Bresnahan Grocery, and that was there probably in the early 1900s, and that's one of the stores that was there. Another one that was in town was the Franklin Grocery, and that was in the Ray block, and that was on Main Street, and that was there for a number of years. And I saw a clipping in the Franklin Sentinel that said that a guy by the name of Charles Quinn, for the past 5 years, he was a clerk in that store. And then he ended his duties there and he commenced his new duties at the Richardson Market. Now that was back in August of 1910 that this clipping was. And so Charlie Quinn moved down to Richardson's Market, which was down on East Central Street, into there, and that was Richardson's Market. I'm thinking this picture was taken around 1910, 1920, I think it was. And you can see Richardson's Market, and that's where Charlie Quinn started working. And then in later years, it became Quinn's Market. He apparently bought the market. So he renamed it Quinn's Market at that point. And he kept it for many years until the 1950s, around 1954, when he sold it, he retired, and he sold it to a guy named Jimmy O'Connell. And Jimmy O'Connell renamed it O'Connell's Market. And in later years, in that particular building, a lot of people would remember when the Woonsocket Call had a branch office in that building. A lot of people remember the paper boys would go get their papers from Dutchy Gilbert and count them out. And then in later years, Fico's shoe store would be in that place.
It's really interesting looking at some of these photos of the different markets. It's such a contrast to today where it's largely really large grocery stores like Stop and Shop, Big Y, and Shaw's in Franklin.
That's right.
It's very interesting how there are these small markets, almost like bodegas, that now persist in many American cities.
That's right.
And a few things that I noted are the awnings that they've got, almost to keep the groceries, the fruits and veggies from going off in the window.
That's right.
And probably as a nice little lure of shade to get people in the door.
That's right. Yep.
There's actually a fascinating resource I had a chance to tap into when I was writing the history of Franklin in 2012. It's a sanitary survey of Franklin. It exists as one copy from a sanitary engineer in 1917. And it's got fascinating insights on how Franklinites lived and worked at that period of time, spanning everything from our nascent sewer system at that point in time to all the restaurants and grocery stores in town. And there's some fascinating details about some of these little markets. I'd actually be interested to revisit it and see if he referenced any of them by name.
Oh, wow.
But one of the interesting things is that as recently as 1917, there was still a process where butchers would, by wagon in some cases, because it wasn't over to motor vehicles yet at that point in time, would carry loads of meat around the town and basically show off, like, hey, Mrs. So-and-so, here's a steak you might want to buy, and so forth, which is a very different way of delivering food than we're accustomed to today.
And you would wonder how they would preserve the meat. I mean, you obviously want to refrigerate it. And I'm sure there was no refrigeration on that.
They would, I think, typically bring like blocks of ice with them, but it was always a concern about the meat spoiling halfway across town, particularly in the summertime.
Especially in the summertime,
as you might imagine.
Absolutely, right. Yeah, one of the things that you find that in the 50s, that's when the big supermarkets really started to come into their own. And we'll be talking about that as we go along. But yeah, most of those stores were the small grocery stores where you would go in and you wouldn't just go in and do your own shopping. You wouldn't go around to the aisles and take your own groceries off the shelf. What you would do is the guy would be behind the counter and you'd say, okay, I need a can of grapes or something. He'd go over and get it and say, what else do you need? And then when he was all done, instead of the cash register adding up all the groceries, he would take maybe the paper bag, the brown paper bag, and take a pencil and put all the prices down and add them all up. And then say, okay, you owe $10.43. And the cash register was a mechanical cash register where you'd find the buttons and like that. So there was a whole different thing. Yeah. And this is the day that Charlie Quinn retired, and he's on the left, and Jimmy O'Connell's on the right, and that was the day he retired. Yep. And just to the left of that is the A.J. Cataldo Building, and that had a couple of stores in it. It had the Gloria chain store and the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Now, some people refer to that as A&P. So there's a little trivia question for you. What does A&P stand for? Atlantic and Pacific. And they were there in the 1930s, and they eventually moved over to West Central Street. And this was the Carl Harris garage. This was built around in 1926. Originally, it was built as a 40-car garage. A lot of, I'm sure a lot of people remember going into that store, but it was originally built as a 40-car garage. Very long building.
I notice in the advertisements in the window, it's kind of interesting. The plaid stamps. I'm gathering some sort of rewards program, essentially.
Oh yeah, like Stop and Shop used to have what was called top value stamps. Gas stations used to have S&H green stamps. Sperry and Hutchinson, for those who want to know what S&H stands for. And basically what it was, you would get a stamp for every 10 cents you would buy, we'll say. You would get the equivalent of one little stamp. And if you bought $1 worth, you would get a stamp for 10. You wouldn't just get 10 individual ones. Or if you spent $50, you would get one $50 stamp. And you would buy, they would give you these free booklets, and you would lick those stamps and put them on the page. And if you got a book full of $25 worth of stamps, that would be, a full book. And after a while, if you accumulated enough books, you'd go to a store, a redemption store, and you would cash them in. I can remember a woman across the street from where I lived gave me a whole bunch of S&H green stamps. And so as a young kid, I was like, wow, this is great. So I went and I started licking them all and putting them in the book. And in Woonsocket, down at Park Square, there was a redemption store. And a gentleman that lived upstairs said, hey, I'm going to that store. Did you want me to bring your books? And I looked through the catalog, and I said, okay, this is what I want. And it was a game, I think it was. And he brought my books in. Sure enough, he redeemed them.
Wow.
In fact, I've still got a card table today that I got from Stamps. It's still in my cellar. It's a round table. I still have that from S&H Green Stamps.
Hang on to that for sure.
Oh, I know it. So, but in case people are wondering where this is, it's where the 7-Eleven Plaza is today, just over the bridge on West Central Street, almost across the street from the Black Box. So that's where that garage was, and that's where this A&P was. Because the thing that people remember is the smell of 8 o'clock coffee grinding in there. That just as soon as you walk through the door, that smell would hit you. In fact, Market Basket to this day still sells 8 o'clock coffee. They've got the machine right in the aisle. So I walked by there and I thought, wow, I remember A&P. So, yeah. Now over on Alpine Place, back in the day, in the 20s, a guy named Francesco Brunelli owned this place and had a little store in there. And Mr. Brunelli eventually bought the block of stores and buildings where today's Rome Restaurant is. And he created a little diner there called the Clark Square Diner. And in later years, and we'll see a picture of that in a few minutes. I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. But he bought the block where the Rome Restaurant is. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So now on Main Street, right by the bridge, there was this building that was known as the Exchange Building. And in the next slide, you'll see a better picture of it. But it's right on the bridge. In fact, that railing you see on the right is right where the bridge is. And there was a store called T.M. Turner, and it was located there. And he was located there for over 20 years. But in 1898, a gentleman named George Peck took it over and renamed it Peck on the Square. And he was there for many years. But Peck on the Square was another grocery store downtown Franklin. And then this is the better picture of it. This was taken around 1940. And it shows Peck on the Square. And you can see where it says IGA stores. That stood for the Independent Grocers Alliance. Back in the 30s, this Independent Grocers Alliance started to really take off. A lot of stores would affiliate with them. And I think you mentioned a lot about that in your book.
Yes, and it's interesting with the IGA because it's pretty much non-existent at this point in Massachusetts. I was astonished a few years ago to drive by one, today just a sort of larger grocery store that's probably more just a chain grocery store versus a really independent one somewhere in Burrillville, Rhode Island, in the west of the state. They still exist up in Canada. They're pretty common in Quebec and maybe even Ontario and stuff like that. Okay. But they seem to have largely faded from the scene here in Massachusetts.
Right. I know Rentham Center had an IGA store too, but yeah. So that's that. And then in later years, Martin's department store would relocate to that spot. They had a fire in the building where he used to be. He used to be over where Newberry's was. But in 1944, they had a fire in Depot Plaza, and then Martin's department store moved to this building. So. And then on Main Street, at 22 Main Street, this is back in March of 1939, this store opened up. Now 22 Main Street, that's where Victor Pizzini has a shoe store today. It's right next to the alley where the diner used to be. You can see where it says next to the Franklin Diner. And that's where that was. It was run by Belgenio D'Orazio.
And I think it's really kind of interesting seeing the specials that they have. I don't quite know what the price would be like compared to today. Probably higher for most of these things. Wow. But it's interesting because I know one of the things that a lot of historians on the big picture have been sort of looking at recently is the globalization of food supply. And America sort of led that because we weren't as closed in as many countries in Europe were for a long time. So even when countries like, at this point in time, 1939, Nazi Germany were pretty much just eating rye bread or whatever they could source from fields in Germany, Americans had access to bananas and oranges and all these things brought in on refrigerated ships from very tropical climates, or California and Florida and so forth. Right. So it's really interesting seeing that stuff was very much available in Franklin, even if perhaps it was more expensive than it is today.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yep. And then Bhajans Market was a very popular market. I went in there many times as a kid. I used to live right on Dean Avenue. And in the 70s, they would move to West Central Street. That was about the time they were tearing down this block. This is the Fletcher block. And they would move to West Central Street, and eventually they would be known as Ann's Market. The Brunelli family, I think she was part of the Brunelli family. And then the police officer in the picture, his name was Walter Carr. Everybody had a nickname in Franklin, and his nickname was Baldy Carr.
Was he bald?
No, he had a short haircut. But that's one thing about Franklin. Everybody had a nickname. I mean, everything from Chiefy, Baldy, you name it. I mean, everybody had a nickname. Banjo, I could go on and on. I don't have any nicknames though, but anyway. And then this is the inside of Bhajans Market. You would walk in the front door and you could turn to the right and then walk down this aisle. And one thing about Bhajans Market, they were years ahead of their time. In the 1950s, you could call up that store and place your order. And many times I would see the woman sitting, if she had nothing to do, she'd be over there behind on the telephone. She'd have the phone cradled in her shoulder. She'd be writing down an order from somebody. And then somebody would go around and shop for that person, and then free delivery. This Peapod, before they had Peapod, it was free delivery too. And you'd just call your order in. It's like, wow. Unbelievable. And then these gentlemen from left to right, Greg Vajan, and the gentleman in the middle is Don Duncan, and then Harry Vajan was to the far right. And I remember, especially Don Duncan, he used to work in the meat department, right behind, in fact, they're standing in front of the butcher area. And but yeah, Harry and Greg were the Vajan brothers that ran the store. Mm-hmm. And then as you're walking towards the front of the store, this is a view looking towards the front. Mm-hmm. Now, in December of 1920, there was a store in Franklin that was known as the First National Food Store. And it first came to Franklin in the 1920s. And this picture was taken in around that time frame. And the woman in the picture, her name was Lydia Ray Purse. She was the wife of Arthur Purse, who was the headmaster at Dean. Now, originally, this store was known as a Ginter store. But I read on Wikipedia, I did some research, and I found where Ginter stores became First National around 1925, when they became part of the O'Connor chain of stores. So now it became First National Store. And it was run by a gentleman by the name of Charles Malcolmus. And so they were located there. And then, sometime in the 1930s, they moved down to Union Street at the corner of Cottage Street into this building. And for some time, I looked at this picture and I really wasn't sure where it was taken. And really doing a lot of research in it, and I finally figured it out that it was on the corner of Cottage Street. And the clue for me was the building in the background behind the trees was the building that is today's Franklin Mill store. At that time was the Haywood Mills. So that really locked it in for me. So First National moved to there. And in earlier years, there was a store called McCabe and Cody. And I see a lot of their advertisements in the early 1900s. So they were there. And there was another market in that building. It was known as Clicko's Market. I don't know if a lot of people might remember Clicko's Market. I used to see a lot of their advertisements in the Oski yearbooks in the 1930s and everything. But they were located in there.
That Clicko term is interesting because obviously Clicko Club Soda was a very big brand that sponsored a number of radio shows from Millis. They had the spring there that they would use for their big bottling operation, which is now kind of a polluted site and sort of this challenge for the town of Norfolk or town of Millis, to sort out. But it's interesting how Clicko, that term seems to have been widely used in branding, not only for that famous soda brand that was popular up until the 1950s, but also at the local level with these smaller markets.
Exactly. Yep. And then in the 30s, First National would move back downtown, and they would locate next to W.T. Grant, and this was in Depot Square Plaza, and next to the W.T. Grant store. And in 1944, as I mentioned before, they had a fire in that building, and they didn't suffer any damage there, but they did decide to move out of there because they're going to really redo that plaza over. So in 1946, they built a building over on West Central Street, and that is today's Black Box. But they built that in 1946 for the purpose of moving First National in there, so it was built for that purpose. And this picture was taken a little bit later than that, but basically, that's where they moved, and it's a pretty good picture. It shows First National. And you can barely see a house just to the left of it through the trees. That was Lorraine Metcalfe's house, for those of you who remember Lorraine.
And that's today a parking lot, basically.
Right. And they buried the house on the spot, so there's always this dip in the parking lot, a sinkhole every year because they buried the house right in the spot. So, oh well. And then in 1963, they moved First National down to a new plaza, which was being built on West Central Street. And this is where it intersects with Beaver Street. Right today, there was a store that just went out of business called Edwin's. It was right on the corner of Raymond Street. That's exactly where Edwin's is today. But in 1963, there was a nursery there called Continental Nurseries that was run by Matthew Van Leeuwen. And so they totally leveled that property, and they built the plaza that's there to this day. And this was when Raymond Street was still you could access Raymond Street from West Central. They've since blocked it off. So. And then in the 50s, supermarkets really started to become known in Franklin. And probably one of the first ones was Brunelli Supermarket. This was on the corner of Lewis Street. That building is actually still there today. In later years, Marshall's department store was in there. And
today it's a paint store, right? I think it's Sherwin-Williams or something like that.
I'm not really sure, but it's that building. It's the same one, right on the corner of Lewis Street. And then in 1963, that was in 1954, by the way. In 1963, they moved across the street to a new plaza that was being developed where the racetrack used to be. And Brunelli's was opening up their supermarket, but at the same time they affiliated with the Star Market chain of stores, so they became Brunelli's Star Market.
A question for you, Joe. I know I've seen photos of construction, I think, at that plaza around 1980 or 1983, somewhere in the early 1980s.
Okay.
Was there the section of that retail space there that's now Aubuchon and Wassing, and
Right.
for the time being, until it goes out of business in a month or so, Bob's Stores.
Yep.
Was that added to that parking lot at some point along the way?
Now, that was the original location of the Brunelli's Star Market. They tore it all down and rebuilt it with where Aubuchon's is.
I see. So essentially, they tore down the original 1963 supermarket and then replaced it with a new one? Or?
I'm pretty sure. It's in the same location. I'm going to hold off. I'm not exactly sure if they tore it down. I think they did, but I'm not sure. But they did add Mammoth Mart to the right of it, which is today's, what do they call that? What's the store to the right of it today? Is it Big G or Big? No.
Not Big Y, but Big Lots.
Big Lots. Okay, that was Mammoth Mart when they built that building. They added on to that. But this is where Star Market was. It was right where the Aubuchon store is. I'm not going to say that they tore this one down. I really can't say that for sure, but I'm pretty sure. But so that's that. And back to downtown. In the building where you see the economy grocery stores, when they were developing that plaza, they built it in 3 sections. You can see where Newberry's was, that was the first building. Where W.T. Granson First National was, that was the second building. And then in 1930, 1931, they built the third building, which is where Economy Grocery Stores is. Now, again, researching Wikipedia and everything, I found out that Economy Grocery Stores changed their name in 1938, and they became Stop and Shop. In fact, with the recent strike that Stop and Shop had, I was reading an article about the history of Stop and Shop, and sure enough, it said there used to be Economy Grocery Stores. So they were there, and then in 1963, they left there, and they became the store Farmland moved into that spot. I don't think Franklin had a Stop and Shop after that until they developed the one down in West Central Street, I believe. I don't think we had one after that. So, and check out those prices, huh? Chock full of nuts. No, chock full of discounts. Chock full of nuts. Oh, chock full of nuts was the coffee. That heavenly coffee. A little commercial there. And then downtown we had a Dinello's Market, and that was located in the Morse Block.
You can see the Morse Theater there actually quite prominently.
Exactly. Yeah, that was, because as we discussed in the Morse Block presentation, the Morse Block had a big fire in 1928, and then the Morse Theater was built around 1928. So this picture was taken around 1950. But yeah, that's the Morse Theater. Yeah. And then on the bridge, we had Strickland and Restaino. That was that market right there. They sold, it was also like a Gorelick Brothers dairy store, but it was Strickland and Restaino. And here's a picture of Ed Strickland. He was standing in front of his store. This was about 1937 or so.
I love the road sign there with the distances to Bellingham, Milford, Grafton, Worcester, and all of that.
You know, I'm glad you pointed that out, because to this day, now that when they reverted back to the two-way streets, if you're coming down East Central Street and you're going to stay on 140, there is no sign per se on the bridge that shows that 140 goes to the left or goes straight. It's kind of assumed. But to me, we know it. But I'm wondering if a lot of people coming in town will get a little confused when they get to the bridge. They should put something back there saying 140 does go straight. It wouldn't be the end of the world if they did turn right. But you know, it's just I find it curious that they didn't put some sort of a sign there. So maybe they will because of this. You know, whatever. And then here's another place, the Charles Acaro grocery store. That was down on Union Street, and it might look familiar to a lot of people because that eventually became the Union Cafe. And then today it's known as the Union Street Grill. And they've added on ever since this picture was taken. But that's the original building that was there in the 30s.
It's interesting with that little side alcove. You can tell is just full of fruits and veggies under that awning there, and also the big Pickwick Ale sign, which is a brand that we just don't have anymore. That at least to my knowledge,
I've never heard of it, to be honest. And it primarily was more of a fruit stand and vegetable stand, and I suppose that you could consider it a grocery store. But they sold food, so that qualifies. And just up the street, at the intersection of Cottage Street, was Liberty Grocery. And one of my memories was they had a soda machine where the bottles of soda were dangling on this rack and they were immersed in cold water, and that's how they kept it cold. And you would lift up this big lid, and you look, and you saw all the bottles of water, bottles of soda hanging in the water. And if you wanted a particular bottle, you'd take the bottle and run it down the rack, and then put your dime in. It was only 10 cents, and you'd pull it out. And I'm not sure if there was a deposit on the bottle at that point, but it certainly was 10 cents a bottle. I used to love cream soda too. That was my favorite. So, and behind there was a bar room there called the Red Onion, and that's gone now.
And was that bar? I think that was a bar that was actually possibly open until the early 2000s. I know there was a bar that was there as you headed up Cottage Street that was torn down somewhere along the way.
Well, on the corner of Wachusett Street.
Yes,
that was called the Dugout, and that originally started off as the St. Angelo Club. But it was known as the Dugout because they built the foundation and they put the roof on the cellar, and they never built anything above it. So it was the Dugout, and that's the way it was. I never went in there, but it was called the Dugout. I was thinking, well, I guess they formally called it the Dugout, but anyway, yeah. But that was up the street. That was not the Red Onion. I'm not sure when they closed the Red Onion. I think it was probably in the 50s. It's a very small place, though. Turco and Pisano. Turco and Pisano on Hutchinson Street. We are sitting right here in the Turco and Pisano store. As a matter of fact, where we're sitting right now, I think is where the freezer was. It probably explains why it's so cold in here. I'm kidding. Anyway, but Turco and Pisano was in this building. And they really did it over very nice to make Franklin TV. So, yeah. And on the corner of Washington Street was this building. This was John Zappatelli had a market in there back in the 30s. And in later years, a gentleman by the name of Pete Ferrara had a market there, and it was called Ferrara's Market. And later years, he moved to the White Hen. I say the White Hen Plaza. It's 7-Eleven Plaza, but the White Hen Plaza was what it used to be called, and that's where actually Ferrara's Market is still there to this day. And he moved it to that location. Today, I think there's a little pizza place in that location. Now, this is on the corner of Peck Street and North Park Street. And I'm kind of wondering if the current owners of this house know that there was a store in the cellar, right where that door is. The Schilotti family owned that, had a little Schilotti's Market in there. And so that was another little mom and pop store in Franklin. And then down on East Central Street, at the corner of Uncas Avenue, is DeVita's Market. Back in the 50s, we remember it as Johnny's Grocery. From what I remember, they had some really good subs in there and things. But yep, today it's DeVita's Market. And then on Lincoln Street, near Brook Street, is Dacey's Dairy. They had a little grocery store in there. I'm not really sure if it's still there. I think it is. It
is still there. Actually, it is still a Dacey-branded gas station there, and I think a liquor store as well, a small liquor store.
Okay. Yep, still there then. That's yet another one. And then down on Pond Street, near Beach Street, is Art's Grocery. Today, I think it's a DB Mart, I think it is.
And Tabletop Pizza, I believe.
Right. But Art's Grocery was in there. Now, we mentioned about the block where the Rome restaurant is. Well, that's this block. In May of 1894, a gentleman, J.B. McKinnon, started working on a building that's in the middle of that. You can see it's a bowling alley and a pool room. That originally was built as a grocery store for J.B. McKinnon. And in later years, they turned that into the bowling alley and a pool room. And then if you look at the building to the left, you can see this, you can barely see it, but there was a little diner in there. That was the Clark Square Diner that I talked about. Eventually, they moved that diner into the location where that market was. And that's where the Clark Square Diner was moved to. In later years, it became Brunelli's Diner, then the Kami's Restaurant, then the Rome Restaurant, then the whole block was torn down. But anyway, that was a grocery store to begin with. And then right across the street from that was the Cataldo Building, and Amadeo Cataldo had a fruit stand in that location. And in later years, Jimmy's Ice Cream and Jimmy's Liquor Store would be located there. And a lot of us remember the candy in there and everything. But originally it was a fruit stand. And on Main Street, there was, in the Music Hall block, which is today's Metcalfe block, they sometimes refer to it as the Music Hall block, but it really was the Metcalfe block. Charles Fales had a grocery store in there. And people are wondering if Fales Street was named after him. I'm pretty sure it was. I think he owned property down there. So it's probably a safe bet that Fales Street was named after him. So, and the Chilson block. The Chilson block is located right across the street from the post office, today's post office. There's a brick building there right now across the street. Before that, that's where Thunderbird Cleaners was located, for a lot of our viewers that remember that. But the building that preceded that was Chilson's block that was built, it was torn down in 1913 to make that brick building. But that's where Richardson and Emerson was located, in that block. So in 1898, Harry Bullocken developed a store called the Franklin Cash Store. And he sold coal and grain and things like that. But in the 40s, 1944, the store, he had to stop selling that because there was a lot of rationing going on in World War II. So, but he kept the oil business alive, and it became Bullock & Sons. So, and then just across the street, again in that same building on the corner of Cottage Street, there was a little fish market, and it was Moore's Fish Market, and
you'll find here a full line of fancy fresh fish, also oysters and clams.
Wow! Yeah, I know. The advertisements in the Sentinel were really cool. They really very descriptive and things. So.
And I like their fish sign that they had hanging out outside the window.
That's right. So, yep. So I guess that concludes our talk about the grocery stores of Franklin.
Joe, that was a great description of the grocery stores of Franklin. It's really interesting to see how many of them there were just even in the past century or century and a half. There's really been quite a variety of businesses here in Franklin through the years. Really enjoyed talking about all these different businesses with you.
Yeah, great. I'm glad we could have this discussion.
Until next time, I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
Thanks for watching.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.